Hello, everyone, and welcome to Chapter 3, which is Research Methods. This is Part 1 of Research Methods in Psychology. So, today we're going to talk about how we in psychology do research methods. And so this is going to be pretty simple. Let's go ahead and start with an example. So in psychology, remember, we study affect, behavior, cognition. So all of those things. We talked about cognition before, but also feeling states. So this could be a lot of different things. One of the things that I particularly enjoy, and one thing I study a lot, is the psychology of relationships. And so let me teach you how we measure relationships. So here's what I did. Let's measure love specifically in a relationship. So let's talk about romantic love. So here's what I did. I took all the love out for my wife, right? So the love that I have for my wife, I sucked it out of my body and I put it in here. I put it in my daughter's thermos, which may or may not look a little bit strange based off of what's going on here. But here's what we do. When we study relationships, we just rip the love out of ourselves, and then when we can look inside of it and see, let me just unscrew this carefully. Whoa. When we can look inside, and then we can weigh it, and we can say, oh, I've got like 25 pounds of love, and we can say, oh, the love is very bright and pretty, and we can say that there's like 22 milligrams of it, right? That's all we have to do. That's how we measure love. We rip it out, and then we toss it on a scale and say that's how much we got. Of course not. Of course that's not what we do. Now, sometimes psychology gets a little bit criticized because they say we are what's called they call it a soft science. So I have a father-in-law who was a chemistry professor before he retired, and he and I have had this discussion before, whether or not psychology is a soft science. Boy, that just drives me crazy, drives me nuts, because we in psychology are a science. And the reason why some people think that we are a soft science is because it is difficult to get a tangible representation of the things that we measure, right? So in the chemistry, you just go in there and you find your sodium chloride, and you get 20 milligrams of sodium chloride. You put it on the scale. You do whatever you're going to do with it. You see it. It's concrete. It's there, right? Whereas with us, we are often studying in psychology things that are a little more difficult to make tangible. Now, the question that we need to ask ourselves is, does love exist, right? Just because it's difficult, does that mean that this concept that I'm going to call love, does that mean that says love? Sorry, my handwriting's awful. But does that mean that love doesn't exist? Does that mean it's not worth studying? Does that mean that we can't do science about love? In psychology, we say, of course we can do psychology. We can do science about love. We can do science about all the things that are important to us in psychology. Love, memory, understanding, intelligence, depression, worry, anxiety. All of these things are real. They exist. But they're what we call conceptual variables. A conceptual variable. So love, for example, is a conceptual variable. It exists. It's real. But it's a concept. We can't rip it out of ourselves and stick it on a scale or in a thermos or somewhere else, and we can't say, oh, it weighs 20 pounds. And so we in psychology have a big problem that we think that these conceptual variables are really important, that they're real, and that they affect us. And so what we need to do is take this thing and make it concrete in what we call an operationalization. Let me let this thing catch up. Operationalize. I need to move something over. Zation. There it is, an operationalization. An operationalization takes this thing called love and does something concrete or real to make it operational, to make it real. Now, by real, I'm not saying that it's not, love isn't real. I'm saying it's not really tangible. It's not what we call empirical. Empirical means that you can understand it with your senses. And so often this includes doing something where we can put a number to it, right? So for example, one way that you can operationalize love is to count the number of kisses. So if you wanted to measure how much I love my wife, you put me in a room with my wife for an hour or two and you count how many times we kiss each other, right? The idea is the more kisses, the more love. Now, is that a good operationalization? That's a totally separate issue. It is an operationalization. It is an operationalization. Is it a good one? Totally different idea. Totally different concept. So, number of kisses is not necessarily the best operationalization of love. I do think that people who love each other tend to kiss each other more, but I think there's other reasons why people kiss each other besides love, right? So, operationalizations, the reason why some people call us a soft science is because it's difficult to make these operationalizations. Now, there's two kinds of operationalizations: measurement and the other one is manipulation. Okay? Two kinds of operationalizations: measurements and manipulations. That's a U for measure. Sorry, it doesn't look very good. Measure and manipulation. Okay? So you can either operationalize something by measuring it or manipulating it. So in this particular case that we're talking about with the love, we actually changed the number of, we measured the number of kisses, right? And that was our measurement of love. But a manipulation goes the opposite way. We do something in real life that changes, that manipulates the conceptual variable. So for example, let's say that that would have, some people take a love potion. And the love potion is going to change the amount of love. And in this case, instead of measuring love, I have manipulated love. I have changed the amount of love. In psychology, we use operationalizations to either measure or manipulate. Now, manipulate doesn't mean we're trying to go in and hurt people, etc. These kind of manipulations, what we're talking about is a scientific manipulation. We use these when we run experiments. We need to change this concept, love, so that we can see if it affects other things, like anxiety, for example. That's how we would run an experiment on something like love. When you measure something and then measure something again, we call that a correlational study, right? Measure one variable, then measure another variable. When you manipulate one variable and then measure a separate variable that it changes, that is an experiment. And we'll talk more about that later on. But the big issue and the hardest part about doing science and psychology is taking the conceptual and making it real, making it operational. There are two kinds of operationalizations: measurements and manipulations. And we use them differently in different kinds of studies. So here's what I want to do next. I want to talk about an example, but to do that, we need to ask you a question. Let's skip this one. Today, we're going to talk about ideas of what makes studies good or bad, and how would you make a legitimate experiment, how you test those theories, and the difference between internal and external validity. In the next study, we're going to talk more about correlational designs versus experiments, and how you determine the difference and how you make one better or worse. So I want you to answer this question. Would you spend $20 on a product that gives you more strength, energy, and focus? All right. So regardless of how you answered that, we are going to talk about an example of a product that has been purported to give more strength, energy, and focus. and costs about 20 bucks, right? And not only that, it's not only purported, but they did some studies to find out if it actually works. So here's what I want you to do. I want you to watch this video that's produced by the Power Balance people. Now, Power Balance doesn't exist anymore, but the Power Balance bracelet was kind of a big deal for a while there, a while ago. I want you to watch this, and then we're going to talk about this study. So when you watch that study, you need to know that that was an experiment. When they had the person put the Power Balance bracelet on or take it off, that's a manipulation of a variable that's in this case, it's the presence of the Power Balance bracelet, right? That little mylar hologram that they say can focus your energy field, right? That is the independent variable. An independent variable is something that causes a change in a dependent variable. So in this particular thing that you just watched, the independent variable is the Power Balance bracelet, the Power Balance test, the Power Balance bracelet itself, right? So putting it on, taking it off, that's how you manipulate the independent variable, right? It's either there or it's not. That independent variable, the Power Balance bracelet, causes a change in balance. So the bracelet changes balance. The bracelet is the independent variable. Balance is the dependent variable. The thing that we, the researchers, change, that we manipulate, is the independent variable. The thing that we measure afterwards is the dependent variable. The dependent variable. So I want to know, how would you design an experiment to test whether this bracelet works? You should know that that was an experiment. That was definitely an experiment. But was it a good one? Was it a good experiment? So let's talk about what makes something a good experiment or a bad experiment. When you were thinking about how you would run this test, you were probably thinking about several different things, right? So for example, perhaps you were thinking about how the Power Balance employee was administering the test. Could it be that the guy who was, actually pushing down on his arm, that was administering the test, the guy was putting the bracelet on and off, could it be that he might, maybe even unwittingly, maybe without meaning to, maybe he actually pushed a little harder when the participant was not wearing Power Balance bracelet, and then pushed a little softer when he was wearing the Power Balance bracelet? If that was the case, then that is what we call a Rosenthal effect. The Rosenthal effect is when the researcher's expectations make the result happen in the participant. It's called Rosenthal effect because Rosenthal was a famous psychologist who studied what's called self-fulfilling prophecy. He's the one who did a study with a bunch of elementary school kids. So he went to a bunch of third graders. So he went to a class of third graders, and he gave an IQ test to all the third graders. And then he said, okay, here, teacher. And he only talked to the teacher in this case. He went to the teacher and said, all right, teacher, here's a list of what we call bloomers and non-bloomers. Based on the test that we just gave, we can tell that some of these students are going to be what we call bloomers. Their intelligence is going to bloom within the next year. It's really going to have a lot of intelligence. And these other ones, they're non-bloomers. They might seem pretty bright right now, but they're really not. It wasn't really based off of their intelligence test, though. It was only random. They randomly put kids into the bloomer and the non-bloomer group. So they left the teacher with that information. They didn't tell the kids. And they told the teacher, don't tell the kids that they're bloomers and non-bloomers. And then they came back at the end of the year. And they said, oh, okay, good, great. Let's go ahead and give another intelligence test to your students. And guess what they found? Students who had taken, who were called bloomers, who were in the bloomer group, did significantly better on the intelligence test than the ones who were non-bloomers. But it was totally random whether or not they were bloomers and non-bloomers. There shouldn't be any real difference between those two. So they went to the teacher and they said, hey, did you treat them any different? These kids did better, right? The bloomers did better than the non-bloomers. Did you treat them any different? And the teacher said, no. Oh, no, I would never do that. I would never treat them any differently. But somehow these bloomers became better. What had happened is the teacher, without realizing it, unintentionally, the teacher had treated the bloomers differently than the non-bloomers. Her prophecy, her self-fulfilling prophecy, made the bloomers actually act more intelligent, become more intelligent. So she would do small, simple things, subtle things, like she would give extra time for the bloomers to respond to questions so that they could think about it and had to work harder. Give them a little extra assignments. The non-bloomers, she wouldn't have that big of expectation, so if they didn't answer correctly, she'd just move on and not push them. And so they didn't do as well. The expectations made it happen in the other person. And in an experiment, the expectations of, for example, the person pushing on the arm might actually make it different, right? If he maybe even unwittingly pushed a little harder when the guy was not wearing the power balance bracelet, that would be a Rosenthal effect. It's not the power balance bracelet that's actually making the change. It is the expectation of the researcher. Now that's different from a placebo effect. In a placebo effect, the participant, the person who's actually wearing the bracelet, that person's expectations are actually causing a change in balance. So it was pretty obvious that he knew when he was wearing the power balance bracelet or not, right? When the guy who was wearing it and being tested, he knew. And if he really believed that this power balance bracelet is going to work, then his expectation alone could make it happen. Now, in a placebo effect, the participant actually believes this is going to work, right? He's not faking it. He actually believes it's going to work. In demand characteristics, the participant doesn't necessarily believe that it's going to work, but he knows what the hypothesis is, and so he kind of fudges things a little bit to make it fit the hypothesis. So, for example, demand characteristic would mean that Akola, the guy who was the participant, right, when he's wearing the power balance bracelet, he's like, you know what, I don't know that I really believe this is going to work, but I'm pretty sure what this guy wants me to do, so I might just, not do as well the first time when I don't have the power balance bracelet on, and then I'm going to try a lot harder on the second one so that I can help this guy out. That would be a demand characteristic. So the difference between demand characteristic and placebo effect is both of them are about the participant, but in the placebo effect, the participant actually believes it. In demand characteristics, the participant doesn't necessarily believe it, just wants to mess with the hypothesis. Okay. The last thing we need to talk about is what's called the order effect. Now, in this particular case, the same person was given the power balance bracelet, was tested without the power balance bracelet and tested with the power balance bracelet. They always did that in the same order. They always did that in the same order, meaning they always, whenever the power balance people did this, they always did it without the bracelet first and then again with the bracelet. This created an order, and the order was actually causing a change in the balance. So what I'm saying is, if you took care of the Rosenthal effect and the placebo effect and demand characteristics, you would still get the results that they always did it better with the power balance bracelet on, because they always had the power bracelet on second. They always did the test with the power balance bracelet second. And the order effect was practice. The first time they did the balance thing, they weren't practiced. And so the second time they did it, they were practiced. They would have done better the second time no matter what. Regardless of having the power balance bracelet on or off, they would have done better. Not because of the effects of the bracelet itself, but because of the practice that they had. So here's what we do. In psychology, this was an experiment, right? It's meant to show that something causes something else, but it's still a poor experiment because it doesn't control for these things. Now, the way you get rid of the Rosenthal effect and demand characteristics is making something called a double-blind experiment. In a double-blind experiment, the double means the participants and the researchers. Blind means that they're both blind as to what the hypothesis is really trying to do, or at least the levels of the hypothesis that each person are in. Here's what I mean. If the researcher is blind, then the researcher doesn't know whether or not the participant actually is wearing a bracelet, the power balance bracelet or something else. Okay, he's blind. In demand care, when the participant's blind, the participant doesn't know whether or not they're actually wearing the bracelet or not. To be double blind, both the researcher and the participant should be blind as to what condition the participant is in. Now, how would you do that? Now, for this particular case, there have been follow-up studies that have been done on this, and so here's what they do. They cover up, they don't let the person administering the test know what bracelet the person's wearing, right? And they always cover it with a wristband, so they don't know which one is which. But then you say, but hey, wait a minute. If they're not wearing a bracelet, they're pretty sure they know that they're not wearing a bracelet. Well, that's where the placebo effect comes in. You use a placebo bracelet. So when they do this study, here's what they do. They take like a 30-cent just basic plastic bracelet versus an actual power balance bracelet. They don't let the participant or the researcher, the participant or the person administering the test know which of the two the person's wearing, and they cover it up. They administer the test, see how they do. This takes care of the placebo effect because the person doesn't know if they're wearing the real power balance bracelet or not. The order effect is taken care of by randomizing which one you get first. You get the placebo first, or do you get the actual power balance bracelet first? That's how you get rid of the order effect. So even though we have, we can do experiments in psychology, we often have to think about problems that can happen like these. When we are dubious as to whether or not the actual independent variable, so my pen's running out of batteries is what it's saying. So if power balance really is causing the effect in balance, right? If something has good internal validity, then they have a good logical reason to think that the actual independent variable, power balance bracelet, is actually causing the change in balance in the dependent variable. However, they have bad internal validity if it's something else, like practice, that is causing the effect in balance. If it is something other than the independent variable that's causing the change in the dependent variable, then you have poor internal validity. Internal validity means that the hypothesized independent variable is the one that's actually causing the change in the dependent variable. Poor internal validity means that there's another variable, like practice, for example, that is causing the change, not your independent variable. External validity means, do the results of this study apply outside of the study, right? Do they apply in the real world? So in the real world, would the power balance bracelet actually cause more balance outside of this fake, push on your arm study that they did? That would be external validity. Okay. So answer this question. A conceptual variable has been operationalized when we have a clear way to measure or manipulate it. So operationalizations are either measurements or manipulations. Those are the only kinds of operationalizations we have. You take a conceptual variable and you measure it, you've operationalized it. You've made it concrete or real. If you do something to change the conceptual variable, you have manipulated it. Those are the two kinds of operationalizations. All right, thanks everybody.